And we are back for prepping for winter with the Tyrion sample chapters. When we last left Tyrion, he had joined the Second Sons with Jorah and Penny, promising to pay the sellsword company a massive amount of money if he happens to somehow conquer Casterly Rock. This all mirrors Stannis at the Battle of Weiss, where he also promises to pay a large sum of money to the Iron Bank if he somehow happens to win the Iron Throne. Both men even sign their contracts in blood, which invokes a contract with the devil, although in reality blood signatures tend to flake off as blood is not a great ink. Now we don't actually have the text for the first Tyrion sample chapter, only the second sample chapter. But George R.R. Martin did read the first Tyrion sample chapter on 2 occasions, once at EasterCon in April 2012 and once at MizCon in May of 2012. And from those 2 readings we have several fan summaries floating around, though sadly none are very detailed or comprehensive. In fact, they all jump around a bit and even contradict. This may be because what characters say is often not what they think or believe. Unlike with the second Barristan sample chapter, no single summary is really superior, nor does any single summary contain all of the vital information. And so I actually struggled a bit on how to present this information from the different summaries on Tyrion 1. I decided in the end to take one summary and then intersperse information from other summaries. It may be a bit jarring, but here we go. For the second chapter, we join Tyrion playing Cyvasse with Brown Ben while they wait for Sir Grandfather's army to sally forth and try to break the siege of Meereen. Tyrion seems to be in quite a good mood. He was joking a bit with Plumm and tried to convince him to change sides to Dany. They discuss the pieces and draw parallels to the dragon piece and Dany's dragon on the battlefield. The meat of this chapter is that Tyrion, while slowly beating him at Cyvasse, floats the idea of Brown Ben returning to Dany's service. Tyrion is bluffing that he's about to win the Cyvasse game. Now I should mention that the first summary calls the Tyrion chapter the second chapter, but this is because George R. R. Martin had read the Victorian chapter right before this at the convention. To be clear, we're talking about Tyrion 1, the first Tyrion sample chapter. So here we find that the chapter opens with Tyrion playing Brown Ben Plumm in Cyvasse. Cyvasse is of course Planetosi chess, and George R. R. Martin is an enormous fan of chess. He actually organized chess tournaments for a living for a period of time. Additionally, a proto-version of Tyrion was actually developed first in a story called Under Siege. It involves a protagonist who is a drunkard chess-playing dwarf who gets his heart broken. He also sends his consciousness back in time, much like Bran in the Werewood Net. Now, Cyvasse is also a fairly obvious and heavy-handed stand-in for war and the Game of Thrones. And we get a sense that many metaphors about real war and what's going to happen in our story can be seen on the Cyvasse board first. For example, Tyrion plays young Griff in Cyvasse and tricks him into not using his dragon. This occurs while Tyrion is also tricking him into not going to Dany, who has dragons. The point of all of this is that we're supposed to look to Cyvasse for clues about how our characters will act in war and in the Game of Thrones. And so it's unfortunate that these summaries don't tell us too much about what's going on the Cyvasse board. Perhaps the chapter simply doesn't say. Now what we do know is that Tyrion is playing Brown Ben Plumm, who has played this game before with Tyrion, and we actually know Ben's Cyvasse style. Hungry, somewhat imaginative, but wary and conservative. Tyrion had previously beat Ben 4 out of 5 games at Yezzan's party in A Dance with Dragons. That said, it's important to note that Brown Ben Plumm did win 1 game, meaning his strategy is sometimes effective. The time Ben won was when Tyrion overreached with an unsound assault. Of course, this is actually what Barristan is doing in the field. He's advancing with a fairly unsound assault. And the Second Sons are currently on the side with the much larger army, and they're fairly far from the fighting. All things considered, playing it conservative, that is, playing it Brown Ben's style, is probably the best way to go. Now, one of the summaries says that Tyrion is beating Brown Ben Plumm at Cyvasse, but another summary says that Tyrion is bluffing about beating him. I tend to believe the latter account for a couple reasons. First, we know from the second Tyrion sample chapter that Tyrion is not in a good mood. He is feigning his good spirits, which makes me think he's feigning other things. The second reason I think Tyrion is actually losing the game is that it would parallel the situation on the ground. Brown Ben Plumm is on the winning side of war, but Tyrion is trying to convince him that he's losing. Things would match if Plumm was on his way to winning his 6th game of Cyvasse, but Tyrion were trying to convince him otherwise. These two share banter with others of Brown Ben's staff about what's the worst thing about waiting for the battle to start, punctuated by the sound of the trebuchets as they fling more plague corpses into Meereen. Throughout the chapter, you hear thumps. as the rotten and sick bodies that are sent from the Yunkai trebuchets land on the walls, buildings of Meereen. This sets the mood for the whole chapter. Chapter opens with Tyrion and Brown Ben Plumm playing Cyvasse and listening to the Yunkai trebuchets throwing corpses over the wall. They have a lively conversation, with Tyrion discussing how you can tell which trebuchet is launching based on its sound. Tyrion seems to be in much better spirits and back to his old, insufferably witty self. Lots of funny moments in this chapter. Brown Ben Plumm is disturbed by the sounds of the trebuchets that keep flinging pale mare. Nice description of some of the bodies flying through the air and some arms separating. I think I counted the names of 7 trebuchets. So here we find that Brown Ben seems to not like the wait for the battle and seems wary of war. Additionally, he doesn't sound like he's a fan of the splats of the corpses. Tyrion, on the other hand, seems to be in good spirits and cracking jokes. Now, as I mentioned before, we know from the second Tyrion sample chapter that Tyrion is definitely not looking forward to battle. He is just as wary as Brown Ben is, if not more, and so I would guess that Tyrion is faking his good mood and trying to get inside Brown Ben's head. Now we get a bit about how each of the trebuchets makes different sound. The final summary errs in counting the name of 7 trebuchets. There are only 6, but I imagine Tyrion goes through each of the names: Harpy's Daughter, Harridan, Wiccan's Sister, Mazdan's Fist, Dragonbreaker, and the Ghost of Astapor, and likely repeats a couple, making a miscount likely. Now the maddening splats of bodies and the wariness of war is perhaps a callback to another Cyvasse player, Doran Martell, who was also acting wary of war while oranges would splat around him. He too found the splats annoying. Like a ticking clock, the splats seemed to enhance the pain of impatience. Though in the case of Doran, he was faking wariness, while Tyrion is likely doing the opposite. Now, I find it very interesting that so much time in these sample chapters is dedicated to the trebuchets and describing the trebuchets. Barristan's main mission is to take down the trebuchets, and Jorah later mentions that this would be his strategy as well. And yet, the trebuchets aren't really doing anything that important. They're launching bodies. Yes, the trebuchets are useful in orienting oneself to the battlefield, but it seems like they need to become relevant militarily at some point. I would say that the narrative demands that they eventually launch weapons, and I do suspect that they are set up to fire short, that is, onto the field of battle, rather than into the city. Brown Ben muses that the 2 dragons are wildcards, which could attack anything on either side during the battle. They assume Dany will return on the 3rd dragon, and speculate about rescuing the 3 hostages, Daario, the eunuch, and the horseboy, and delivering them to Meereen, thereby changing sides a second time, but claiming that they only pretended to change sides before so as to learn the Yunkish plans. The meat of this chapter is that Tyrion, while slowly beating him at Cyvasse, floats the idea of Brown Ben returning to Dany's service and freeing Daario and the other hostages. Brown Ben seems very concerned with the money the Yunkish lords are wasting and doesn't immediately reject the idea. The overall atmosphere among the commanders in the Second Sons felt very tense. They lash out at Tyrion's wit, and Tyrion is sort of the comedic relief for Plumm. Tyrion thinks for himself that the only way to stay alive and be relevant to Plumm is to keep winning Cyvasse. There was suggestion that the 3 hostages may be loaded onto the trebuchets soon. So here we find out that there's talk of the Yunkish putting the hostages on the trebuchets and launching them. The 3 hostages are of course Daario of the Stormcrows, the eunuch is Hero of the Unsullied, and the horseboy is Jogo of the Dothraki. Now, as I noted with the Barristan sample chapters, the bodies being launched from the trebuchets is a callback to the Battle of the Blackwater, with Joffrey launching his hostages, the Antler Men. And this talk of launching Daario, Hero, and Jogo, hostages that can be ransomed for money, makes the connection a bit more obvious. And as I mentioned before, this connection is rather relevant as the Antler Men flew an incredible distance, nearly across the river, because the machines were designed to launch heavier objects. The dead bodies are currently not going very far, just into the city of Meereen. This means that stone or pitch, which weigh more than people, would be firing a much shorter distance. The stones and pitch aren't going to make it to the city, they're going to be firing onto the battlefield. It's also interesting that Brown Ben mentions the Yunkai wasting money. We haven't heard about the Wise Masters being in money trouble, so perhaps Brown Ben just thinks it's poor judgment. Daario, Hero, and Jogo could pull good ransoms. And this parallels Joffrey wasting money by killing the Antler Men, who owed the crown a considerable sum of money. Of course, Yunkai having money troubles could spell their doom if they cannot afford to pay their sellswords, or if they can't afford to pay the Dothraki if they come and demand gifts. So here we hear about the Second Sons feeling rather tense about war with the dragons being wildcards, and they are all convinced that Dany will return. This is odd as many people assume Dany is dead. Victarion certainly heard that rumor coming into Slaver's Bay. The Second Sons believing that she will return seems to show that Tyrion is getting to them. We also see a bit of a way forward for the Second Sons. They feel they need the hostages to get into Dany's good favor. If they do go for a rescue of Daario, Hero, and Jogo, they may run into Romo, whose Dothraki will definitely be going for this trio as they are honor-bound to retrieve Jogo. Tyrion thinks any skepticism about this will be outweighed by gratitude that he killed Dany's most dangerous enemy, Tywin. Tyrion thinks for himself that the only way to stay alive and be relevant to Plumm is to keep on winning Cyvasse. The sellswords are considering changing sides. Brown Ben Plumm is worried Dany will kill him, and he's worried about the Volantines. And so here we can piece together what's going on in Tyrion's mind. Tyrion may or may not believe that Barristan's side will win, but one thing is certain. Tyrion is not relevant if the Yunkish win. Tyrion cannot retake Casterly Rock and pay Ben without Dany, and without that money, he becomes a hostage that Ben can sell to Cersei. And so like with his game of Cyvasse, Tyrion has to trick Brown Ben Plumm into thinking that he's on the losing side. Of course, Brown Ben has some legitimate concerns. He betrayed Dany, and the Volantines are coming, but Tyrion claims that Dany will be grateful that he killed Tywin. After all, Tywin betrayed her father. Of course, Tyrion's claim is very dubious. In Dany's mind, Tywin Lannister was only one of Robert's dogs, not the mastermind powerhouse that Tyrion thinks he is. Not to mention, killing one's own father is a pretty brutal move and not something easily dismissed. Both Tyrion and Brown Ben should absolutely worry about what Dany may do to them if they go over. Now it's hard to say if Tyrion is aware of all of this. It may be that Tyrion is just saying things to make Brown Ben go over. Or it may be that Tyrion really thinks that Tywin is important to Dany. After all, Tyrion is obsessed with his father and may think that everyone else is obsessed with him as well. Just as Tyrion is about to win the Cyvasse game, Jorah bursts in with news of black sails in the bay, Ironborn ships, flying dragon banners. The chapter ends with Tyrion winning the Cyvasse game 6 turns in advance and Plumm disregarding a messenger. The messenger finally tells Plumm of the massive amount of ships in the bay, and Jorah points out that they aren't Yunkish or Volantine ships, but Kraken ships with Targ banners. Someone spots on the horizon that they think the Volantines have arrived, but Jorah Mormont spots the Krakens on the sails and says they are also flying dragon banners. And so here we have Tyrion about to win his game of Cyvasse, or at least claiming he's about to win. Since he says he's 6 moves until checkmate, it's a bit difficult to verify the claim, and considering Brown Ben is ignoring his messenger, it's likely that he is busy trying to figure out how exactly Tyrion has won. It seems very likely that Tyrion is bluffing about the win, just as he's bluffing about everything else. Now, perhaps this doesn't matter, as the point of this end scene is to clearly show that one can have great plans and then something random can come in and spoil them. The Ironborn are clearly that. They interrupt the game of Cyvasse just as they interrupt the battle. And we should remember that Cyvasse player Doran Martell even told us, "We princes make our careful plans and the gods smash them all awry." So we now know for certain that the Ironborn are flying Targaryen banners, which is a pretty big deal as we know from the Barristan sample chapters that the 3 blasts from the Red Lamb's horn is to signal to advance to the Kingsguard banner or the Targaryen banner. And we know from the Victarion sample chapter that he plans on blowing his dragon horn 3 times. With Larak the Lash dying, he holds the Kingsguard banner. The communication and movement of Barristan's army rests with Tumco Low, who holds the Targaryen banner, and with the Red Lamb, who has his horn. Based on how things are set up, it seems there's going to be confusion. We have 2 different Targaryen banners, and we have 2 different horns that are going to be blown 3 times. It seems extremely likely that Barristan's squires will fall, and Barristan's army will advance instead to Victarion's Targaryen banner and his 3 horn blasts. And that's it for the first Tyrion sample chapter. Next time we'll move on to the second Tyrion sample chapter, which we actually have a copy of. So we'll see you in Prepping for Winter, Tyrion 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.